Yes, so I think that this is another complex question. And I think that we have a responsibility. I'm looking for a quote. We have a responsibility to understand and be aware. And in the 60s, organizations like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, but even Martin Luther King, believed that political education is very important. If you're going to fight a problem, you need to understand its character and its root causes. And so understanding the nature of the problem and oppression and racism and inequality is critical to this thing called civic engagement, because we don't want to engage blindly. And the problem before us is epic. So we want to go in with an awareness and with strategy. And as was said before by Principal Brown, we can't take this on individually, because that's going to lead to demoralization and defeat. I think we need organization. We need organization. We need to get together with like-minded people, and we need to together understand the problems and put forth a solution, a proposal. But beyond that, there are all kinds of different ways we can get involved, and getting involved is also a very local thing. It's about, in fact, walking out your building and determining that the people around you are part of your community, your force, what makes you stronger. And then figuring out how to leverage our power collectively. And folks have done this in all kinds of different ways. People do it at the point of production. So right now there's a resolution of the AFL-CIO, by the way, which is great. Like, this hasn't happened in America in a long time, since the 1930s, in fact. The AFL-CIO from Rochester just said that if there is a refusal on the part of the sitting president to remove himself from office, labor is going to go out on strike. Historically, I don't know if you all remember when the transit workers went out on strike in 2000, and you know the power that is there. The transit workers going out on strike paralyzes the city and forces action. So that's what I mean by understanding the world and leveraging power. Where does our power lie? That's part of the process of becoming civically engaged, committing yourself to understanding the system, your place in it, and how to work with others toward transformation.
Thank you, Professor Fernandez. And just so just to make sure that everyone understands, where we are with voter registration. Right now, New York is not in the top 10. Maine, Mississippi, Michigan, Kentucky, they are in the top 4. New York did not make the list of the top 10 states that have registered. Just to share this number with you guys. So we're going to move on right now to the following question. So how do we help our community understand the impact of the electoral participation, and how do we integrate into our economic and racial justice work?
Important to make it real for the community, to see how not speaking up or not using their power would actually impact the economy of their local community. The dollars that are coming in for services, for our schools, for different organizations to come in and give them that support. I feel like when we paint that picture and say you can have such big impact on the policies that are created right here in New York City, no matter what age you are, what nationality you are, what ethnicity, I see that there's a change. You see families more engaged, see families asking more questions, being open to making these connections to even organizations or institutions that they wouldn't typically do so. And thinking of integration is just like being a part of the process, you know, giving them an opportunity to be invited into groups. So that way they could be able to say their side. You know, I'm sure we have parents here today listening in on the panel that, you know, would have a lot to say, even if we would have a similar panel afterwards, to really get their insight on issues just like this.
Interesting to hear, you know, what we can do as a community to enhance the electoral participation, right? I feel like, and it may just be me, but I feel like we as a community first need to get more investment from the folks who we are electing in office. And I think that when you see a return on your investment, right, the same way how you would invest money into a particular stock, the same way you see that return on investment is the same way you will be more apt to engage with that particular stock. Same thing with politics. I feel like once our investment is returned to us, right, we will start to now see a greater impact in the electoral participation. I think for now, right, what we're seeing is a big jump, right, a big increase in the process of folks wanting to come in and vote because of what we see as representation with our administration. I don't know who here is aligned to what party, so I'm not going to, more of a bipartisan communication is there are folks in office right now who are not serving our communities. And that in itself, right, that in itself is what may hasten people from being more involved in the electoral process than we recommend. But once we start to vote our people in office, the people who we know are going to enact change in our communities. Why? Because we've met and dialogue with these people. Why? Because these folks have come to our neighborhoods and have dialogue with us. Right, then we could start talking about how we can increase and impact the participation in voting, right? Because this is basically what we're talking about here. And then when we start to talk about the integration of our economic and our racial, our social, I like to call it social justice, our social justice work, they have to go hand in hand, because what we are asking for our politicians and our folks who are representing us to get involved with is our economic, right, and our social justice inequities, right? We're in a state where our employment and economics are not equitable. And we are also in a state where our there are racial disparities. There are disparities in how our communities of color versus communities of predominantly white residents are treated and resourced. So when we start to see more buy-in into us, I think that's when you'll start to see the impact of our electoral participation increase, and then the integration of the economic and the social justice workers just go hand in hand, because that is what we're asking folks to do in our communities, right? Support us in getting a job, support us in getting quality healthcare, support us in getting quality education, support us in getting quality policing, security, right, in our neighborhoods. And I'm not even going to get into infrastructure right now, right, because some folks may not experience that. There are disparity levels on infrastructure, right? But I'm not even going to get into how our roads, our streets, and our buildings look, right? But once we start to see the increase in that participation and that advocacy for us in that magnitude, then we will start to see an increase in folks voting and caring about who's in office, because those folks got to care about us. And right now there is a gap. There is an undeniable gap. And once that gap is closed, then I think us voting and us having fervor around voting will also increase as well.
I disagree.
Thank you, Principal Brown.
Yeah,
I disagree. I think that there also
Guys,
is
we're gonna have.
Oh wait, sorry.
Guys, we're gonna have time in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Yes, we're gonna have time in a couple of minutes, to ask questions. Right now, we're just gonna get to the questions, and then we'll open the room to additional questions.
I got you, Ms. Evelyn. I'll get back to you.
All right. I'm ready.
Professor Fernandez, did you want to answer the question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure others want to answer this question. I think I hear where Principal Brown is coming from, and I guess I want to take a step back. So during the pandemic, billionaires in the United States increased their wealth by 30%. While people in the city are sleeping at Riverside Park right now. So independently of what's going on at the top of society, there is a savage inequality going on that has been going on for a minute. Let me give you a sense of what that inequality looks like, because ultimately it explains why we have a threat in the society in the form of the expansion of white nationalist militias, the Proud Boys, who, by the way, have headquarters right here in New York. Did you know that? New York. The Proud Boys have been organizing in New York. They're the hipsters in Brooklyn. So in the last 50 years, the United States has experienced the largest transfer of wealth from the bottom of society to the top than has ever happened in human history. And when such a massive transfer of wealth has happened from the bottom to the top, it's happened because of a military coup or a revolution. And in the United States, it happened without a peep. What does that mean? Our wages decreased, our schools got worse, our hospitals got worse, people are unemployed. We're worse off today, economically, objectively speaking, than we were 50 years ago. Not just Black people and Latinos and everybody. And how did the ruling class get away with this? By scapegoating immigrants, the bad hombres, and scapegoating Black people, the criminals, right? This is the dog whistle. This is the new racism in the United States after the civil rights movement made explicit racism not cool. W.E.B. Du Bois, a very important Black historian and writer, said that the way that this society has been able to keep the people at the top in power is by giving white people a psychological wage. The notion that we might not be in a good situation, but at least we're not Black and we're not Mexican or Puerto Rican or Dominican. But the reason why we see the crisis in this society that we see and the threat of fascists in certain party, literally, is because there is a massive inequality that is affecting working class white people as much as it is affecting working class Black people and Latinos. And the system can't address our needs. We saw it during the pandemic. And how are you going to keep this society in check? You gotta blame somebody. And the question is, can the people on top of society, can the governments address this crisis? The problem is so structural. It is organized around the priorities of our system. The priority of the system is organized around profit and the hell with our humanity. And we saw that during the pandemic. 216,000 people dead, the majority disproportionately our people going to the poorest hospitals in this country. That is a crisis of epic proportion. And if the system does not address that fundamentally, people are going to be like, well, why vote? What's the difference? Now, in this election, I think it matters, in fact, because the threat of neo-fascists is so significant. And we can't really underestimate that. And we can go on to talk about what exactly that means. But I think that we have to pressure elected officials to respond. And I just want to very quickly quote what Martin Luther King said at the end of his life. At the end of his life, this is the radical king. And I asked my students, oh, who said this? And most of them think it was Malcolm X, but this is Martin Luther King. There are 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask the question about the whole society. We are called upon, and then he goes on to say, it means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that we have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? So we got to ask these fundamental questions if we are going to find real solutions to the problems that have been plaguing us since time immemorial.
Thank you, Professor Fernandez. Bharati, do you want to answer this question as well?
Yeah, and I think it's how do we help our community understand the impact of this, right? And it's just as Ms. Fernandez says, we've got to ask the question. For far too long, whether you were born here or you're from somewhere else, it doesn't matter. I think if you don't ask questions, you don't know the source of anything, and it affects everyone. And you do have to apply some pressure. You have to be strategic about how you apply that pressure because you don't want chaos. But sometimes, organized chaos is the best way to get recognized and get things done. And I think by asking questions, our community will know, and then it'll go into how do we integrate this into our communities? How do we integrate it into the jobs that are there? If you ask questions, then we don't just have a certain job, a certain position in a community to do certain things. And then it goes back to the leaders that we elect. By being active, by getting involved, you put people in place, not only about that looks like you, because somebody could look like you and me, and what does that really look like? You look at Ms. Fernandez, if you didn't see her name, you don't know her background. You look at me, you don't know my background. Am I Indian? My ancestors were. I was born in Guyana in South America, right? So a lot of things, because of our diverse communities, if we ask questions, we're better able to understand the needs. And by putting people in place, we also have to listen about their policies and what they stand for and what they do. Actions speak louder than words. And I strongly believe, asking questions, as our panelists have said, is an important way, to integrate all of this into our communities.
Thank you, Bharati. So some of you guys already answered this question, but I'm just going to ask the question differently. So how do we reframe the elections around issues that are important to our community? With COVID-19 happening, elections coming up soon, housing problems, community violence. So how do we reframe elections around these issues? Principal Brown, it looks like you want to go first.
I just, as you bring up these issues, it's just, the question is a great question, right? It's a very good question, and it's a very large question. And when we start to think about these things, it's like, well, where do we start? I mean, there are just so many things that we can start with to just highlight for our elected officials to say, hey, we need resources and support in these items. But it's always the where do we start? How do we start? Question that is daunting. As I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, I'll stop talking to allow any of my colleagues to time to talk.
I don't want to speak. Maybe Diana wants to answer the question.
I'll be happy to. I think it is a big question to unpack, right? How do we reframe elections around the issues that most impact us and the communities we serve, and thinking about knowing how to recognize platforms and what are the true intentions also of people that are running for offices. I think oftentimes, it's very high level, and a lot of our constituents will get lost in the sauce kind of thing. So they hear all these cool things that might happen. Oh, this person, like Bharati was saying, they might look like me, and that's why I'm going to vote for them. But really, what is their stance on the things that are most important to me, and what has been their history about it? So how have they voted in the past? What have they done for the community? Sometimes there's oftentimes they never see these people in the community. So, you know, it might just be they get your vote and then they're out of it. You know, losing trust, but these are the same officials that get elected over and over again that we see, not really investing and probably divesting in the communities at that point. Knowing where they stand, not only, I know we outlined food insecurity, housing, community violence, but, you know, what are some of the other things that are impacting Black and Brown families? You know, we know that healthcare is a big one, especially in the Bronx. Knowing, you know, what is bringing to the table, what services, you know, how are they meeting the needs, especially during the pandemic? Of course, food insecurity has been major. We see numbers that have doubled, tripled since March, and we see them steadily rising instead of decreasing. Even now that we're going to be entering November, and we're expecting that to increase. You know, what's being done on their end? And then, you know, like participating, even the presidential election, you know, how does that impact? What are those platforms? How is that going to trickle down? Because those federal policies, sure enough, trickle down to state, and then they trickle down to the city. And this is why right now, as a CBO, also we're facing cuts that are going to impact students and families. And so, you know, come in 1 month, who knows, we might be less 50% of services because of things that are happening up at the federal government.
Thank you, Diana.
I think that we need to like be very basic about this, because our needs are very basic. That's the thing, that this is not like rocket science. Lebanon Hospital, I grew up not far from Lebanon Hospital. My uncle died of COVID at Lebanon. He was triaged. There were no ventilators. So there were no ventilators. So they had to make a decision of who was going to get a ventilator. And you know what the New York Times reported? Oh, where you ended up, what hospital you ended up at during the COVID nightmare determined whether you lived or died. If you ended up at a ruling class hospital, you're gonna live. If you don't, you're gonna die. So we need healthcare. And in fact, healthcare is a human right. This is the only country, advanced country, that doesn't provide healthcare on the basis of human right. It's a profit industry in the United States that is uncivilized and inhumane. We need better hospitals, and we need healthcare as a human right. We need schools. Our schools are falling apart. We don't have enough funding. Right now, we don't have computers, even at the college level. I was teaching during COVID. We had to stop teaching for 2 weeks at CUNY because students didn't have computers. And that's at the college level. Imagine at the elementary level, all of the kids whose parents undocumented don't have working, but don't have the resources, because we pay a third of our rent in New York City. We need housing. We need housing that is affordable, and we need housing with dignity. We need jobs that pay a decent wage, We shouldn't work all of our lives up until we die, which is what all of our parents did and are doing. So it's pretty basic, but we're living in a system that doesn't care about the human being. And we saw that because we saw the failed state amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was horrifying to us here in New York City. So we need to raise these questions: health, jobs with dignity. We need investment in our communities. Violence? What violence? The violence in our stupid little communities, knick-knack violence, is nothing compared to the violence that the United States has deployed abroad against the Iraqis, against the Palestinians, against people in Latin America. We're talking about mass-scale violence that has destroyed entire cities. So, and if there's violence in our community, it's because our communities have been defunded. No resources. I grew up during the crack epidemic in New York City, in the Bronx, looking to one side abandoned buildings and to the other abandoned buildings. Yeah, you know why the kids in the suburbs don't steal cars? Because they got them. So we need our people work. The majority of our people work, but the money doesn't go back into our communities. It goes into the pockets of the fat cats. So this conversation about violence is crap. The real violence is being deployed by Wall Street day in and day out. Our people's, the working class people who have homes in this city, not a lot of them, their homes are being foreclosed left and right now. That's violence. That's violence on a mass scale. The fact that we destroyed Iraq is the oldest society, one of the oldest human societies. US bombs, which cost billions of dollars, destroyed that city. We could have used that money to rebuild the Bronx.
Just to add on to Ms. Fernandez, because you raised a great point earlier with the where is the money going, right? I was always told to follow the money in politics, and it is something that is powerful because it shapes the agenda. So when I hear how to reframe the elections around the issues, I start to think about, well, then what's the agenda, right? The agenda and the issues have to be aligned. If there's misalignment in that, then it's going to be a gap, and there is misalignment in that, right? Because there are fat cats that are donating to both sides, to both parties. There are agendas that are not aligned with our agendas that are being carried out, again, on both parties, on both sides. So it's how do we now get our voices to be heard higher than the voices of the fat cats, of those who are supporting and donating the dollars to the politicians that are being elected? Because again, we've experienced that money does sway who is elected. There is a correlation between how much money an elected official generates to if they are going to be elected in the end of the race. So it's how do we then now fine tune the alignment of the agenda that our politicians are coming in with versus the issues that we as a people and our communities have. There should be natural alignment in that, but in many cases there aren't. And I think that is also something that is highlighting the fact that there is a lack of or a void in what we are asking for and advocating for versus what is actually happening in our communities.
And I think to join on that, stepping back a little bit about how do we reframe elections, it's my community specifically, the Hindus throughout, there's over 5 million Hindus, right, throughout New York. I am more than sure that our brown community is funding every candidate, every elected official, every project that's going on in the community. And I know for a fact, because I was on a conference yesterday, the Hindus are the only religious, practice that does not have a Hindu holiday in the school year. Why is it taking so long? How many more signatures are we going to need? How many more petitions are we going to need? How many more city council members are we going to talk to? How many more signatures are we going to collect, right? So what happens is we have to hold them responsible. We have to think about all the things that is being done. And not just when they get a seat, not just when we vote a candidate in, because we see it throughout every borough. Sometimes they're sitting there for 1 or 2 years. Someone else decides to step up and challenge them and they lose their seat. And I think we have to consistently hold all of our elected officials, our community leaders, to account for what they're doing before they get the seat, when they get the seat, and even after they get the seat, by calling them out, by finding out what's going on, what's happening to our community. If it's a school that needs something. I saw on the news the other day, there's a field that needs replaced, and even the school or parks department is saying it won't happen. And even if they did look at it, the construction wouldn't happen. You have the youth, the kids, the community playing on something that is so unsafe. And we see that every single day in our communities. And I'm not saying that people in Manhattan are not suffering, because I know families that are going through a lot. They are in their suit and tie and sleeping on a cardboard box on the street because they cannot afford rent. How is that possible if you are working? How is it that even if you are working and paying taxes, you still cannot afford low-income housing? These are issues and things that are happening in our community. And I think even with elections, we have to continuously be on top of things and let our voices be heard. And like our moderator said, social media is something that is so powerful now because you could reach so many more people. You could hear so many more voices, and you could jump onto so many more platforms that you do have a voice and you can use it well, you know, and all the money that is going out of our space, we need to bring it back to our communities, and we need to ask for it. We need to ask for it. If not, it's going to be left in the corner. It's not going to be touched. There's no resolutions that are coming out. There's nothing. Everything from any defunding that's happening to reallocating those funds and making sure that they're being used. And we need to stay on top of those things, you know. So with everything that is happening from those that we put in office, that we elect, that we put them there, you know, we can easily take that away by just using our voice. So it's important for us to look at everything that our community needs, because there are a lot of people, a lot of youth, seniors that are suffering, a lot of working families that are still suffering.
Thank you, Bharati. So before we open the floor to questions, guys, this is going to be the last question. So how do we invite the undocumented community, Mott Haven, since, you know, the South Bronx, to be civically involved? They're undocumented, they are not allowed to vote, but how can they still be, how can they hold their electable officials accountable? Any of the four panelists can answer this question. How do the undocumented community, Mott Haven, the South Bronx, how can they hold their elected officials accountable?
Advocacy. Speak up. Go to local leaders, right? Just because you may not be able to vote, right, doesn't mean that you cannot influence or support or advocate or speak to or add value to someone who can vote, right? Or elect or officials, leaders like us in our communities. Again, it's when a silenced voice will never get their needs met, right? A closed mouth never gets fed. So it's important that regardless of your situation, you still have an avenue to speak. You still have a voice. Just because, and I think that media does this sometimes. It kind of, because folks may not have certain statuses, whether it be because they're immigrants or whether it be because they are on parole, right? Because that's another way in which our voting rights have been taken away from us. If you are incarcerated, you come out of your incarceration, you've been quote unquote rehabilitated, you're still unable to vote, right? So those folks, those populations still, right, have a voice, right, and their voice should still be met to us with value, right? Just because those folks, those individuals can't vote, doesn't mean they shouldn't come up to people like myself, who's a principal, professors, community leaders, nonprofit leaders, nonprofit founders, and speak to us about the things that they want to see made enacted in their community as change as well, or things that they may need for their communities to be successful, right? Period. So voice, they still have a voice, an avenue for a voice. And I think that it's more accountability on us as the leaders in our communities who know those folks to then reach out to them and have create a space where they can speak to us, and then we can create that dialogue.
Thank you, Principal.
I think that this is such an important conversation. Undocumented people are very vulnerable in this society. I mean, they're the target of the president. The president has called them bad hombres, and sick the cops on them, and an alphabet soup of organizations. I think that it is our moral responsibility, because all of us are immigrants or children of immigrants, to stand up for these people and to say, why are they here to begin with? One day, East Harlem was Puerto Rican, and the next day it was Mexican because of NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement allowed large American agribusinesses to set up shop in Mexico. And guess what? Big business displaced small Mexican immigrants, small Mexican farmers, excuse me, in Mexico. So where the hell are they going to go? They're going to come up north to get a job. So it is U.S. foreign policy and economic policy in the Dominican Republic. Why are Dominicans here today? Oh, because in 1965, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic during a revolutionary situation. And what the United States does is that it then opens up migration to the United States as an escape valve so that the hotheads to essentially stop a revolutionary process. So of course that started migration of Dominicans on a mass scale to the United States. And you can see that after the Vietnam War, our war in Vietnam, over 1 million Vietnamese migrated to the United States. So it is US foreign policy that propels migration, and capitalism has historically depended on a malleable, cheap army of labor to do its work. So it is our responsibility really to defend everybody, to stand up against these people who are really vulnerable. But you know what? There are plenty of people in the undocumented community, and I've had the opportunity to speak with them, who are doing what they can. But I think that in this moment of vulnerability, our responsibility is to be our brothers and sisters keepers.
Thank you.
Same. I definitely agree with Professor Fernandez. Like we are here, everyone here in this virtual room, you know, is a representative of an undocumented. And so even if they don't have the power to vote, we do. And, you know, and hearing what are their concerns, what are their issues. I think locally as well, we have the opportunity to participate on different actions that are happening. Right now, I'm part of a group, Our City, Our Vote, which actually looks to seek voting privileges for the undocumented on local elections. So that is something great that we could engage our community members in, but also different organizations to get together and address this issue of how can we increase that power. I think our undocumented families, empowering them to also share with everybody in the community, what are the things they see, what are their rights. You know, we talk about know your rights and being able to, you know, bring workshops like that, but keeping it further, like who are the people they could contact if they're in danger? You know, what are some of the other organizations they could connect with when they're at a pass that they really don't know what to do, or they're a little lost in the system as well.
Thank you, Diana. Bharati, did you want to add something else to this question?
I mean, you know, like Ms. Fernandez said, it's important to be our brothers and sisters keepers. When the pandemic hit, like I mentioned before, in June, we started giving out food. And I tell you, it was like a farmer's market set up, and everything was just free for the, you know, taken. And why did we as a community, as volunteers, as neighbors, have to do that for our fellow brothers and sisters? Because the government wasn't doing it. And if they were, it wasn't coming to a level where our neighbors were getting it. And if I'm eating at home and my neighbor has nothing to eat, or the building across the street has nothing, that's not a friendly thing, much less a human thing to do. And I think that it's important. We had a lot of people, you know, thanks to in some ways to the mask, and not because of the pandemic, but people felt safe coming out, not showing their faces. And we had cameras, we had videos, we had media there, and you did not get a single complaint. And I've held about 10 of them so far. And we've given out over 15,000 storybooks to the community members, who some of them may have never gotten a new book in their hand as a child because they've been getting it from the libraries. But we've been able to give out tens of thousands of pounds of food, fresh produce, grocery item, pet food for all of these families. And they came out, and one question was asked: do we need ID? And we told them, no, we're not taking your names, we're not taking your address. I've worked it out with my community partners so that they can keep the numbers as account for what they need to do. But we were not taking anybody's information. And sometimes, you know, this is the way to go, especially when you're trying to help someone. I don't need to know who you are just to give you food so that you can have something on your table. I don't need to know who you are if you are bleeding and need some sort of care, you know, or protection, whether it's domestic violence or some other violence that's going on. But we live in a society where you have to have, you know, everything and a blood print to get what you need. And it's very difficult. And now we see more and more by people speaking out, and by having advocates, by having a brother or sister that'll stand up for you without sharing certain information, that our undocumented communities and those who may feel alone actually have someone there. So It's so important. And sometimes you just have to tell people, we don't care what documents you have. We don't need it. Even if it's a simple flyer that you put up, they'll know that it's like, you know, Diana said, it's a safe zone to come into. And sometimes our community, we need to be reminded that not all of our community is functioning at an Excel level of social media and every day, because they come from a family that some of these kids who are in high school and college doesn't even know what a laptop looks like. So we have to remember those basic things. These families came from practically nothing. That is why they came here, for a better life, for a better family, to have the opportunity to live and just breathe another day. And I think by doing our part, it can come as simple as putting up a flyer. Undocumented are welcome. No documents needed. And put it in whatever language will help, or let people know when you speak it. And I think when you speak it and you're verbal about that, the word will get around. And one person might turn into 10 people, and the next day it'll be 100 people coming to your doors for help, right? And they don't have to be hurt, abused, or dying. And the paper doesn't have to stack up to show that undocumenteds are here in numbers. We already know this. But I think there's enough resources, if we use it the right way, to go around to everyone on an equal level. So it's important to share that we are there as brothers and sisters for each other.
Thank you, Bharati. So now Dennis will be joining us. We're gonna open the room to, you know, for questions, additional questions. We're gonna do Q&A. So if you have any questions, either type in your questions in the chat or turn on your mic and ask the question. We ask everyone to be respectful to our panelists and to make sure that the questions that they ask are not debate questions. You know, we're not talking politics today. We are talking about civic engagement. So we are opening the floor for additional questions if you have any additional questions to the four panelists.